I booked the motel on a late Thursday evening after a long shift at the hospital. I had intended to stay closer to the city, but everything within walking distance was full, and the hospital staff recommended this place for its convenience. It was a budget motel, the kind with cracked linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights, the type you usually avoid unless you have no other choice. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a couple of old cars with flat tires and peeling paint. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting uneven light across the asphalt. I checked in quickly, barely noticing the receptionist behind the counter. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with the stale odor of carpet cleaner. I didn't care. I was tired and wanted a shower more than anything. The hallway to my room was narrow and dimly lit. I was assigned a room at the very end of the wing marked West Wing, in faded, peeling letters. The paint was chipped along the edges of the walls, and the carpeting was threadbare and frayed. There was a faint odor of mildew in the air, subtle enough that I didn't think much of it at first. I dropped my bag on the bed and glanced down the hall. The door at the far end of the hallway was slightly ajar, though I assumed it must have been left open for maintenance. I didn't give it much thought, telling myself it was probably housekeeping. The room itself was small and Spartan. A single bed with an uneven mattress, a wooden dresser with a drawer that didn't close all the way, a tiny table with a plastic lamp, and a television mounted awkwardly on a corner wall. The walls were a dull beige, and the paint had begun to bubble near the corners of the ceiling. I locked the door behind me, checked the chain, and set my bag down. The air conditioning unit hummed quietly, filling the silence with a monotonous background noise. I turned on the shower and let the hot water run, the sound of it soothing after the long day. The water sputtered slightly, struggling at first before settling into a steady flow. I washed quickly, rubbing the fatigue from my body, and then dried off and changed into sleepwear. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, scrolling through my phone. The hall outside was empty, the only light coming from the flickering fixture above the door. Around midnight, I turned off the TV and set my alarm. The motel was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning. I tried to push the slight unease at the end of the hall out of my mind. The door to the west wing remained slightly open, a dark rectangle that seemed too still, too quiet. I told myself it didn't matter. Maintenance would be in, or maybe the door had been stuck that way for years. I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke suddenly to a sound I couldn't place at first. It was faint, low, and rhythmic. A humming, almost melodic, like someone muttering words under their breath in a language I didn't know. I froze, listening carefully. The sound came from the direction of the west wing door at the end of the hall. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough that I could hear it clearly over the quiet of the motel. I convinced myself it was a television or a radio from somewhere else in the building. Maybe another guest. I tried to ignore it, turning over in bed and pulling the blanket closer around me. The humming continued, soft but steady, an insistent pulse that refused to be dismissed. I got up once just to check the hall. I cracked my door open slowly, peering down the hallway. The light from the ceiling fixtures flickered intermittently, casting the walls in pale, uneven shades of yellow and gray. The west wing door was still slightly ajar, and the humming stopped the moment I looked in that direction. I felt my pulse quicken and closed the door slowly, telling myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. Maybe the wind had caught something in the old building, something loose that made noise when the air shifted. I went back to bed, but the unease lingered, thickening with each passing minute. I tried counting sheep, reciting phone numbers, anything to occupy my mind. Every time I drifted close to sleep, the humming began again. Low, steady, deliberate. I kept my eyes closed, pretending not to hear it, but I couldn't ignore the subtle vibration in the air. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, a rhythm that almost felt like it was timed to my breathing. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to sit up and look down the hallway again. The humming stopped immediately. I waited, holding my breath, staring at the dark shape of the west wing door. After a few minutes, nothing moved, nothing made a sound. I returned to bed, but the tension lingered, a heavy presence pressing in from the hallway. Eventually, I must have dozed off in fitful half-sleep. The next morning, the first thing I noticed was the sunlight creeping through the small, grimy window of my room. It made the air feel warmer, the shadows less threatening. I got dressed and went down to the front desk. The motel janitor was just finishing his rounds, pushing a squeaky cart loaded with cleaning supplies. I mentioned the west wing door, curious if it had been opened for any reason. The janitor's expression changed instantly, a tight, wary look crossing his face. He told me flatly that the west wing had been closed for years, sealed off because the structure was unsafe. No one should have been in there, no one at all. Maintenance never entered unless there was a scheduled inspection, and even then, only during the day. I walked back to my car, the morning sunlight making the building appear almost ordinary. The hallway seemed harmless in daylight, the flickering lights replaced by steady illumination from the sun streaming through the small windows along the wall. The door at the end of the hall was firmly closed, its dark interior no longer threatening. I realized then that I had been alone in a building with an entire section officially off-limits, and somehow something or someone had been there. The humming had been real, and it had stopped the instant I looked in its direction, as though whoever or whatever was there had noticed me. I never found an explanation for the sound. There was no one in the motel that night, no evidence anyone had entered from the outside. The experience left me shaken but oddly alert. I couldn't dismiss it as imagination or fatigue. It had been too precise, too intentional. I left the motel and didn't look back. The empty hallway, the slightly ajar door, the humming, it all stayed with me. Even now, years later, I remember the weight of the silence, the strange rhythm of a sound that should not have existed, and the certainty that someone had been where no one was supposed to be. I had been looking forward to that weekend for months. A simple escape with two friends to a small lakeside motel in Ontario. We were chasing quiet, early morning fishing, the kind of solitude that meant waking up before dawn and standing on a dock with rods in hand, the water still as glass. The motel listing online promised exactly that. Calm water, a long wooden dock, and a secluded spot surrounded by forest. Sounded perfect. When we arrived in the late afternoon, the sun was low, brushing the trees with a warm light, but the lake did not match the photos. The water had receded far from the shore, leaving mud and silt exposed, and the dock was rotting. Half of it leaned into the water at a slant, boards splintered and darkened from damp. We parked anyway, telling ourselves the fishing would be worth it. The motel itself was unremarkable. A single-story building with peeling paint and an asphalt parking lot, but clean and functional. Our room overlooked the lake, or at least what remained of it. From the window, I could see the broken dock jutting out at an awkward angle, the forest lining the far shore, dense and silent. We spent the day fishing and exploring the shallow water near the bank, wading into the mud carefully to avoid slipping. The water smelled earthy and stagnant in spots, the kind of smell that clings to boots and socks. There were old logs sticking out at odd angles, and the shoreline was littered with debris that had been left behind when the water level was higher. My friends were optimistic, shrugging off the broken dock, but I couldn't help noticing the way the forest seemed unervingly still. There were no birds, no movement beyond the occasional ripple in the water. By the time we returned to the motel, the sun was already dipping, and the water took on a deep gray hue, reflecting the darkening sky. We ate in our room and sat by the window, casting occasional glances at the dock. Creaked under its own weight in the wind. As night fell, the forest beyond the water became a solid wall of black. We went to bed early, the quiet lulling us to sleep. I remember glancing at the clock before drifting off, around 1 a.m., and feeling that peculiar weight that comes with being in a place both familiar and completely isolated. The motel room was ordinary, but the lake beyond it carried a presence I couldn't identify. I woke suddenly around 3:16 a.m. At first, I thought it was a dream, but the sound persisted. Slow, deliberate splashing from the lake. It wasn't continuous, more like someone stepping through the shallow water at intervals. I stayed perfectly still, listening. My friends were asleep, breathing steadily. The noise came from the part of the shore closest to our room, right near the broken dock. It didn't sound hurried or random, more methodical, like someone measuring each step carefully. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and shined it out the window. The beam cut across the water, illuminating mud, logs, and reflections, but there was nothing visible. No silhouette, no movement, just the disturbed water where the sound had come from. I stayed there for what felt like a long time, waiting for another splash, but none came. The night was still again, the forest beyond the shore silent. Sleep was impossible after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shapes in the shadows outside, slow movements at the edge of the dock. I eventually got up and pulled on a jacket, thinking I might walk along the shore to see if anything had left traces. My friends slept through it, and I didn't want to wake them. I stepped carefully over the warped boards of the motel's small walkway, the air heavy with moisture and the faint, pungent smell of mud. The night was cold against my skin, and the silence made every step feel louder than it was. The water lapped softly against the exposed mud, but there was nothing. No footprints in the wet silt, no disturbance beyond what had already been made by the wind and our earlier activity. I returned to the room before dawn, the uneasy feeling lodged in my chest. Morning brought light and clarity, though not relief. We went down to the shore after breakfast, and I immediately noticed something I hadn't during the day before. In the mud near the water's edge were drag marks, wide and irregular, leading from the water into the forest. They were unmistakably recent, soft edges where the mud had been disturbed. The pattern was odd, not a line a human could have made while walking or running. It was too wide in spots, too deep in others, with a staggered path that seemed to twist as it approached the trees. My friends came over and we studied the marks in silence. They led into the forest and vanished among the roots and undergrowth, the soil too thick for the pattern to continue clearly. The scale of it was unsettling, like something much larger than a person had moved through the mud, dragged or carried, without concern for precision. We spent the day fishing, trying to ignore the marks. The dock was dangerous to walk on, and we kept to the shore or shallow spots. Every so often, I would glance at the forest, noticing that the drag marks ended somewhere deep, where the undergrowth thickened. There was no sign of anyone or anything, no footprints beyond the odd marks. My friends shrugged it off, suggesting maybe a deer had slipped or a log had fallen in the water, though the width and irregularity of the drag made that seem unlikely. I didn't argue. I couldn't explain it either, and I felt foolish bringing it up repeatedly. That night, we stayed inside, lights on, curtains drawn. The lake was quiet, no splashing, no movement. I couldn't shake the image of the marks leading into the forest, though, pressed at the back of my mind. How something could move through the mud like that and disappear entirely, leaving nothing else behind. When we left the next morning, I walked the shore one last time. The water had receded further overnight, exposing more of the muddy edge. The drag marks were still there, now partially dried and cracked. I traced them with my eyes until they disappeared under the roots, and for a moment, I considered following them, seeing where they went, but the forest beyond was dense, dark, and unknown. We drove away without incident. The motel and the lake faded in the rearview mirror, but the memory of the drag marks and that slow, deliberate splashing stayed with me. It was unnerving, not because it was supernatural, but because it was real, tangible, and inexplicable. Something had moved from the water into the forest in the middle of the night, leaving traces that made no sense and then vanished completely. I never returned to that lake. Later, I read about beavers, deer, and other large animals, trying to reason the drag marks and the sound of the water, but nothing fit perfectly. The most likely explanation remained something entirely plausible. An animal larger than us, wading through shallow water, dragging a log or carcass, leaving behind evidence that could be misinterpreted by human imagination. Even now, years later, I can picture it. The broken dock, the low water, the dark forest beyond, and the drag marks disappearing into the undergrowth. The motel was ordinary, the weekend uneventful otherwise, but those traces, slow splashing, and the feeling of being watched without seeing anything made the place feel alive in a way nothing else I've experienced has. It was a simple, quiet weekend on the surface, but the evidence left behind told a story of something much larger, moving through the night, and I can't forget it. I missed the last train out of Louisville that night, a miscalculation in timing that left me stranded along a stretch of backroads I didn't recognize. The darkness was complete, the kind that settles deep into the trees and fields and makes everything beyond the car's headlights vanish. My phone showed no signal, and the digital maps flickered uselessly before shutting off entirely. The only option was the faint glow of a neon vacancy sign that hummed quietly at the edge of the road. It wasn't much, just enough to promise a roof and a bed, and I hadn't driven far enough to argue. The motel was small, a single-story rectangle of faded beige, siding with rust streaks running down the corners. The parking lot was cracked, weeds sprouting through the gaps in the asphalt, and the few cars parked there were older models, each coated in a layer of dust that suggested they hadn't moved in weeks. Inside, the office smelled like a mix of cleaning chemicals and old cigarette smoke, sharp in the nose yet undercut by the scent of something damp and lingering. Instead of a digital system, there was a dusty ledger resting on a desk behind a small glass partition, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I could hear the faint buzz of a fluorescent light overhead, and when I approached, the receptionist, a middle-aged man with worn skin and tired eyes, slowly turned the pages of the ledger to check me in. There were no other guests visible, the hallways empty and dimly lit by single bulbs with shades coated in grime. The room I was given had thin walls that already felt like they were eavesdropping. Even with the lights on and the door locked, I could hear muffled voices and movement from the neighboring rooms, though it seemed impossible. No one else had come in while I was there. The furniture was basic: a double bed with a lumpy mattress, a wooden chair with a cracked seat, and a small table with a lamp that cast more shadow than light. The carpet was faded and smelled faintly of mildew, and the air conditioning unit rattled softly in the corner, humming in a way that never fully quieted. I unpacked slowly, aware of the emptiness beyond the thin walls, aware of the silence that felt too heavy for a place that had people staying there. I tried to keep myself busy, going through work emails on my laptop, though the Wi-Fi was non-existent. There was no signal for my phone either, so I couldn't call anyone. The isolation became more pronounced as the hours passed. By the time I decided to go to bed, it was past midnight. I left the lamp on because the dark outside the small, cracked blinds felt too vast. Around 12:48 a.m., I woke to a subtle shift. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a twitch of nerves from traveling alone. Then I noticed the door latch had moved slightly, the bolt no longer flush against the frame. I froze, listening. The hallway was dark except for a sliver of light under the door from the emergency exit sign at the far end of the corridor. A shadow passed under that slit of light. It wasn't large, not a human shape stretched out, just a low, crawling form that moved silently across the floor. My pulse quickened. I couldn't tell if someone was there or if the shifting light had created a trick on my eyes, but the latch was undeniable. I stayed perfectly still, eyes fixed on the door, every sense straining. The air felt thicker, somehow heavier, as if the room had compressed around me. I imagined someone outside, watching, maybe even leaning close to the door. My mind raced through the options. Call the police and have no signal, shout and attract someone unknown in the hallway, or sit and wait until sunrise. I waited. Time became granular, each minute stretching like taffy. The sound of the air conditioner became a white noise barrier between me and whatever was out there, and every creak from the building felt amplified. Eventually, the movement stopped. The shadow did not return, and the door remained closed. I didn't dare sleep immediately, instead leaning against the wall near the door, eyes on the bolt, fingers pressed lightly against it. I thought of breaking the door down if anyone tried to force it open, though the idea of actually doing it was exhausting and frightening. Hours passed slowly, each creak from the ceiling, each faint whisper from the walls making my body tense again. Eventually, exhaustion overcame the fear, and I dozed lightly, waking intermittently to check the door. Each time, the bolt remained undisturbed. Morning came sluggishly. Light spilled across the cracked blinds, revealing the hallway outside. I dressed quickly and went to the office. The receptionist was there, eyes tired but alert. I asked if anyone else had checked in during the night. He looked at me for a long moment, flipping through the ledger. No one else had arrived. The room had been empty all night. He didn't seem surprised, only slightly weary, as though this was a question he heard more often than he wanted. I left the motel slowly, glancing back at the building, the fading neon sign, the cracked parking lot. The strange tension of the night remained with me even as the sun warmed the road ahead. Driving back to the main highway, I considered the possibilities. Someone could have tried to enter the room, yes, but how? The halls were narrow, and there was no evidence of forced entry. The shadow I saw may have been someone outside the window, though the blinds were closed and the shape precise and low, moving across the door. My imagination could have played tricks, but the bolt had moved, and my nerves hadn't fabricated that. The experience left me on edge for days, replaying it in my mind, analyzing every possible explanation. I considered the isolation, the lack of cell service, the way sound traveled through those thin walls. I thought about the empty parking lot and the strange clarity of the shadow under the door. I accepted that sometimes there is no neat conclusion, that some nights leave questions without answers, but the feeling of being watched, of someone or something testing the boundaries of that room, stayed with me. I never returned to that motel, and I never traveled alone on back roads in Kentucky at night again. Even now, the memory of the bolt, the shadow, and the oppressive stillness of that room feels as real as it did the night I stayed there. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was quiet, almost mundane, but it was enough to make a simple overnight stop feel like a test of vigilance. The motel itself was ordinary, the furniture ordinary, the fluorescent light buzzing as it always did. Yet the combination of thin walls, isolation, and subtle intrusion created a night that felt far longer than the hours actually spanned. I drove away with the sense that the motel itself, the building and its emptiness, had observed me in some way, and that thought lingered long after the road had led me back to signal, civilization, and safety. By the time I reached Louisville the next day, I could still feel the slight tension in my shoulders, the sense of alertness that refused to leave. I thought about the other rooms, the empty spaces, and how sound traveled there, carrying voices that shouldn't have existed. The motel was just a stop, a necessity, but the memory remained. It was a reminder that even the most ordinary places can hold a subtle, unsettling presence, entirely human, entirely possible, and entirely real. I drove into the town just as the sun was dipping behind the ridges, leaving long shadows over the narrow roads that led to the forest I was scheduled to survey. The motel was on the outskirts, the kind of place you only notice when you slow down enough to read the faded sign. The building was low, single-story, with a cracked asphalt parking lot and peeling paint on the trim. Claimed to be quiet and convenient, which sounded fine. I didn't have high expectations. I only needed a place to sleep, a base to work from before heading into the woods at first light. The receptionist handed me a folded map along with the key to room 7, a small card with a scratch-off number. She didn't smile, just nodded and said not to go near the woods after dark. I didn't ask why. She had the kind of look that made you feel you shouldn't ask too many questions. The air inside the lobby was stale, slightly damp, like the building had been sealed for weeks without proper ventilation. I left my bag in the car and walked to the room. Room 7 was narrow, with a single bed and a small desk. The curtains were thin, almost translucent, letting in the last of the daylight. The carpet was patterned in brown and green, worn down in the center, but the sheets smelled freshly laundered. A metal fan whirred softly in the corner, not loud, just enough to keep the air moving. I set my laptop on the desk, pulled out my field notes, and started organizing the data from the day. The work was straightforward: soil samples, tree species identification, topographical mapping, but it was slow, the kind of repetitive survey work that made you hyper-aware of your surroundings when you were alone. I ate a sandwich from the convenience store down the road, then checked my watch. The room felt colder than the air outside, and I closed the window to stop the slight draft. That's when I first noticed the vents. They ran along the ceiling near the bed. Small rectangular grates painted the same beige as the walls. I didn't think much of them at first, but at 11:47, just as I was closing my notebook, I heard a whisper. It was faint, but deliberate, a soft, almost precise repetition of the notes I had been writing. I froze, listening. It was my voice, the rhythm, the phrasing, even the pauses. I got up and pressed my ear against the vent, trying to convince myself it was the air moving, the fan, some odd acoustics. The whispering stopped when I moved away. I pulled the curtains aside to look out at the woods behind the motel. The forest was thick, trees packed together so tightly that the ground underneath was lost in shadow. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 points of light low to the ground, but not exactly at eye level. They didn't blink or move closer. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. For a moment I thought maybe it was a reflection from the street lamp behind me, but there were no lamps. I watched for a while, the eyes just hovering at the edge of the tree lean, unmoving. I closed the curtains and stayed on the bed, staring at the ceiling until I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe fatigue, maybe stress. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the building made me tense. The air conditioner cycled on and off, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and something damp. I kept checking the vents, half expecting to hear the whispers again. They didn't return, but the unease stayed. By morning, I felt worn, jittery, like I had been waiting for something I couldn't name. When I stepped outside, I noticed the scratches. They ran across the exterior wall, deep and uneven, some gouges long enough to leave splinters in my hand. The strange part was the height. They were 4 to 5 feet above the ground, far too high for any person to reach without a ladder or stool. I circled the building, looking for signs of forced entry or a ladder left behind, but the lot was empty, the edges of the forest undisturbed. The scratches had fresh, dark lines in the paint, and I realized they must have appeared overnight. I ran my hand over one. The wood underneath was raw, jagged. I went back inside and double-checked the windows. All locked. The door to the room was the deadbolt style, heavy and stiff. Nothing had been moved inside. I thought about calling someone, but the town was small. The reception desk didn't seem the kind of place to answer in a rush. I tried to focus on work, but the memory of the eyes lingered. I went back through my notes, checking for inconsistencies, anything I might have misrecorded, but everything matched what I had written. I decided to walk around the motel, keeping the building between myself and the treeline. The forest pressed close, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I didn't see anyone or anything, no footprints in the gravel. The scratches on the wall were the only indication of activity. I measured them, photographed them, trying to make sense of the situation. Logically, someone could have climbed the building, but that would require planning, timing, and the ability to move silently in the dark without leaving other signs. I couldn't think of anyone in town who had the inclination to do that. I spent the rest of the day at the forest site, trying to focus on the survey. Every sound in the woods made me tense. Birds called, small animals rustled, and every so often a branch cracked sharply, too loud to be just a deer. I told myself to calm down, that it was just the forest, that I was alone and safe. Still, I made a mental note not to return to the motel before dark. That night, I kept the door locked and stayed in the room, sitting on the bed with the lights on. I didn't hear the whispering again, and the fan carried a consistent hum that masked every minor noise. I checked the woods from the window a few times. The eyes didn't return. The scratches, I reasoned, had to have been made by a person or animal during the night, but nothing had been visible. Whatever made them had waited until I wasn't looking. The next morning, I left early. I didn't speak to the receptionist, just handed back the key and walked to my truck. I made sure to photograph the exterior of the building one last time, the scratches still raw against the faded paint. On the drive back, I thought about the eyes, the whispering, and the scratches. When I recounted it to a colleague later, they suggested a few possibilities. Perhaps someone had been hiding in the forest, observing the motel for some reason, using the vents to hear inside. Maybe it was a clever prank, though it seemed elaborate for a small-town motel. The The scratches, they noted, could have been made by a bear or another large animal trying to mark its territory, though the height still didn't make sense. I never found a definitive explanation. The motel itself seemed ordinary, the town quiet. I returned for another survey a few months later, but I stayed at a different lodging farther from the forest. I tried not to dwell on the experience, but I remember the precision of the whisper, the pause between the taps on the vent, the way the eyes didn't move or blink. It wasn't supernatural, just a combination of human or animal behavior that I couldn't place, yet it left a mark on me. I understand now that the warning from the receptionist wasn't idle. She had seen or heard something that I hadn't been meant to understand fully. The forest behind the motel wasn't dangerous in a conventional sense, but it was unpredictable. The building, the vents, the scratches, and the eyes were all tangible, explainable elements. Yet the way they converged created an experience that felt designed to make anyone pay attention. I left that town knowing I would never take a quiet motel for granted again, and I learned to treat every warning seriously, even when it came without explanation. The memory stayed with me, precise and grounded, as real as any other field note I had ever recorded. The motel still exists, still advertising quiet convenience. I don't know if the next guest experiences the same things, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The scratches on the wall never faded completely, even after the paint was touched up. And every time I pass through a small town with a forest nearby, I think of that night and the careful, deliberate warning that no one needed to explain in words. I pulled into the motel parking lot just as the sun was dipping behind the mesas. The building looked like it had been left behind in the 70s. Low and long with cracked stucco walls and a neon sign buzzing weakly, flickering in uneven bursts of pink and blue. The air smelled dry, warm, and faintly dusty. My friends and I, 3 college students on a Route 66 road trip, had been driving for most of the day, and we were hoping for a cheap place to crash. The motel promised exactly that. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, just a roof over our heads for the night. The office door creaked as we stepped inside. It was dimly lit, the linoleum floor scuffed and dull, the walls lined with outdated tourist pamphlets in plastic holders. The scent hit me immediately. A mixture of bleach, damp wood, and something I couldn't place. Old, heavy, almost cloying. A single fan rotated lazily in the corner, moving the stale air in slow circles. Behind the desk, the clerk, an older man with a sunburned face and glasses that caught the ceiling light, handed us the keys without much expression. He didn't smile, didn't make any small talk, and didn't ask for identification. I remember thinking how quiet the place felt, like we'd arrived somewhere abandoned but still functioning, the kind of place that seemed to exist only because it had to. Our room was small, 2 twin beds pressed against opposite walls with a narrow aisle between them. The carpet was thin and coarse, the color faded into a kind of lifeless beige. The bedspreads were patterned with geometric shapes in brown and orange, frayed along the edges. The furniture, wood veneer nightstands, a small dresser, a tiny table, had scratches and chips along the corners. The bathroom was no bigger than a closet, with a single mirror and a shower that had yellowed plastic doors. Everything smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, like someone had scrubbed it down but couldn't get rid of the years of use. We unpacked quickly, leaving our bags on the beds. Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the dry leaves and trash along the edges of the parking lot. The neon sign flickered again, casting a shifting glow across the cracked asphalt. It buzzed intermittently, a sharp electrical hum that felt too close when the night deepened. I remember thinking about how few cars were around. Only a couple of trucks idled at the far end, and a lone SUV pulled out just as we were settling in. The silence settled heavy, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound in the room feel amplified. Around midnight, I woke to the faintest scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, brushing against the window frame or the outside shrubs. Then I realized it was deliberate, the rhythm of it too controlled to be anything random. Nails scraping metal, slow and intermittent. My friend on the bed nearest the window stirred. I pulled myself upright, pressing my ear against the cool glass. Outside, the darkness was thick, The moon had slipped behind clouds, and the dim light from the neon sign barely reached the edge of the motel bushes. Then I saw it, a large figure moving behind the shrubbery. It was hunched low, too fast and silent to be human. Its movement was fluid, animalistic, and yet something about the size didn't make sense. We watched it for a few seconds that felt much longer, and then it disappeared into the shadows, vanishing behind the next row of bushes as if it had never been there. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe a coyote, maybe a stray dog, something from the desert. But the shape, the speed, the way it moved with intention, stayed with me. Sleep didn't come easily after that. Every creak of the air conditioner, every rustle from the shrubbery outside, made me tense. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see it return, but the night remained still. My friends slept in uneasy silence, their faces turned away from the window, as if not seeing would make the fear disappear. Morning came slowly. The sunlight was sharp and bright against the cracked curtains, casting hard lines across the carpet. The neon sign was off now, lifeless in the daylight. We got up, moved quietly around the room, and started packing our things. That's when we noticed the cat carrier. We had left it in the car when we arrived, sealed and closed. A small folding carrier we sometimes brought for our friend's cat during trips. Now it sat in the middle of the room, open, the latch undone. Nothing else had been disturbed. No obvious footprints or marks on the carpet. Nothing stolen. But the carrier had been handled. Carefully, deliberately, opened and inspected. We didn't find any tracks. No signs of someone coming through the windows. The lock on the room door hadn't been tampered with. The only possible entrance was the window closest to the bushes, but it hadn't been opened. The scratches we heard last night could have come from outside, but the position of the carrier didn't make sense if it was an animal. No stray dog or coyote would have opened a plastic carrier, and there was no sign of them entering the room through the small gap in the screen. The motel office was empty when we went to check out. The parking lot was quiet, the trucks gone. We left the key on the counter and walked out without a word. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The road stretched out in front of us, the desert wide and flat, but the memory of that figure behind the bushes lingered. I told myself it had been someone from a nearby property, someone wandering, maybe a transient. That seemed like the only logical explanation. But the way it moved, the timing, the handling of the carrier, it didn't fit. Nothing we could see explained it entirely. For months afterward, I thought about that night. I tried to rationalize it, imagining all the mundane possibilities. The wind, a raccoon, a vagrant, someone curious. None of them fully fit. The scratches had been deliberate. The figure had been too fast to be an animal and too hunched to be normal human. And the cat carrier, inexplicably moved inside the room, was proof someone had been closer than we realized. We told ourselves we were safe, that no one had actually entered the room, but the unease never left. Every time I saw a motel with flickering neon, I remembered the scratches, the sudden movement behind the bushes, and the open carrier. It never became violent, never escalated, but the subtle intrusion, the presence that didn't belong, stayed with me. Even now, I can remember that small motel in New Mexico in perfect detail. The smell of bleach and old wood, the flickering neon sign, the way the night felt heavier than it had any right to, the sensation of being watched without being able to see by whom or what. It was a quiet kind of horror, grounded, believable, and personal. Something had been there, observing, testing, and when we left, it stayed behind, patient, leaving only evidence that it had come close. That's the part one think about the most. The way it was possible for someone or something to move so deliberately in the margins, to brush against our space without leaving anything obvious behind. It made me realize how little control we have when we step into someone else's world, even for just one night. I had been driving for hours through the dark stretches of I-70, the highway stretching endlessly across the plains, a ribbon of asphalt framed by shadows and occasional clusters of scrubby trees. My phone had lost signal miles back, and I had missed the exit I'd been aiming for. The clock on the dashboard read just past midnight, and the idea of continuing until the next town, still an hour away, felt impossible. My eyes ached from the constant scan of the road, and the hum of the engine had become almost painful, like a low-pressure weight pressing against my temples. Then, just as I was beginning to resign myself to pulling over somewhere unsafe, a small neon sign flickered to life in the distance. High Plains Inn. It was a single-story motel set back a little from the highway, surrounded by a cracked asphalt lot and a few scraggly bushes. The light above the office buzzed faintly, yellowish, casting long shadows across the building's facade. I turned the wheel and eased the car toward the office, the tires crunching on gravel patches embedded in the asphalt. The office was quiet. There was a faint smell of cigarette smoke, stale and clinging to the air like a stubborn film. Behind the counter, an older man sat slouched in a chair, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of him. He looked up briefly, lazily, and handed me a key with a flick of his wrist, not offering any words or acknowledgement beyond that. The key was small and cold, attached to a metal fob that rattled faintly when I lifted it. The hallway leading to my room was narrow, the walls painted in a beige that had long since dulled to a kind of dusty gray. The carpet smelled faintly of dampness, mixed with that cigarette odor that had hung in the office. The lights flickered intermittently, and I noticed a faint bulge in the wall near the ceiling where a wire might have been improperly patched. Each step I took echoed softly, absorbed and distorted by the threadbare carpet. My room smelled of disinfectant mixed with dust. The bedspread was thin, a faded brown that had seen years of use. A cracked window overlooked the highway, and I could see the faint shimmer of passing headlights, their beams stretching across the asphalt in thin, interrupted lines. The bedside lamp flickered on and off at irregular intervals, casting stuttering shadows across the walls. I placed my bag on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The highway hummed faintly in the background, the occasional rumble of a semi-truck a low vibration through the room. I checked the locks on the door, turned the deadbolt twice, and then set my phone on the nightstand. Still had no signal. Around 1:03 a.m., the silence was broken. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside my door. I froze, listening, trying to convince myself it was someone moving to another room, or maybe the old man in the office coming back to check something. But when I peeked through the crack of the door, nothing was there. The hallway was empty. The steps returned, sometimes closer, sometimes fading down the hall. I stayed seated on the bed for a long while, heart beating faster than I wanted to admit, listening to the rhythm of the sounds, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But the pattern repeated intermittently for hours. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the flickering lamp throwing brief, disjointed shadows across the room. Couldn't sleep. Every time I thought I had grown accustomed to the sound, the slow shuffle of shoes against carpet would come back, precise, measured, unnervingly quiet except for the faint contact with the floor. I told myself it was someone pacing, maybe sleepless, maybe even a maintenance worker moving through the building. The thought did nothing to calm me. At some point, exhaustion edged closer than fear. I tried to close my eyes, forcing my mind to imagine something mundane, anything but the footsteps. I remembered my plan for the next day, the drive across the mountains, the gas I had barely enough to reach Grand Junction. That kept me grounded, practical. Every time the noise returned, I would tense, listen, and then slowly let it fade into background hum. Time lost its meaning in that room. The hours blended into the faint, gray light that preceded dawn. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep as the sun began to rise, casting pale light through the cracked window. I woke later, groggy, with the light spilling fully across the room. The hall was quiet. I dressed quickly and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind of thin cold that pricks the skin even under a jacket. The asphalt in the parking lot had small cracks filled with dust and gravel. That's when I noticed the tire tracks. They were faint but distinct, deep enough to leave an impression on the worn asphalt. Someone or something had circled my car multiple times. The pattern was deliberate, overlapping, like someone had been walking a careful path around my vehicle with the wheels of a smaller car, or even a large bicycle pressing against the tarmac. What unnerved me the most was that there were no footprints anywhere nearby. The ground around the tracks was untouched, not a mark of shoes, dirt, or any sign of presence beyond the tires themselves. I examined the lot carefully, the length of the building, the hedges, the patches of gravel. Nothing suggested another vehicle had arrived or left in the night. It made no sense, and the quiet panic I felt the night before returned in an unfamiliar form. A creeping, rational dread. I went back to the office to check out, expecting the same disinterested man behind the counter. He was still there, drinking the same lukewarm coffee, staring at a magazine I could barely read. I handed over the key. He didn't look up. I thought briefly about asking him if anyone had been moving around the halls at night, but the words never formed. Felt absurd to ask. The motel seemed abandoned in the most deliberate way, and the tracks, the sound of steps, they didn't belong to anyone who would answer questions. I paid with exact change and left, easing my car onto the highway. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The motel shrank into the distance, a row of muted lights flickering faintly, a small structure tucked into the flat landscape of rural Colorado. The memory of the footsteps lingered in my mind, slow and precise. The tire tracks pressed into the asphalt, overlapping yet perfectly intact, haunted my thoughts. I convinced myself that it was likely a prank, perhaps the old man or another traveler wandering in the dark. Someone careful, someone who had circled my car while I slept, ensuring I would see the evidence in the morning. There was no supernatural element, no inexplicable force, just the deliberate, unnerving precision of someone else's movements, perfectly real, perfectly explainable, but completely unsettling. By the time I reached Grand Junction, the sun was high and the highway busy. I tried to shake off the tension, telling myself the day had begun normally, the route ahead clear. But in the back of my mind, the image of that motel, the cracked window, the flickering light, and those silent, circling tire tracks followed me. Even now, years later, the memory remains clear, not exaggerated, not mystical, simply a night where someone else's presence, slow and deliberate, reminded me that even the most ordinary places could become quietly, insistently unnerving.